Greetings, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started today with our webinar. We're delighted to have you join us for today's webinar, Empowering Equity, the Impact of Multilingualism on DEI in Workplaces and Schools. I'm your host, Ned Buffin, Demand Generation Specialist at Cricket eLearning. At Cricket eLearning, we specialize in customized training in 10 languages, catering to companies, schools and libraries, adults, and youth. A bit of housekeeping for today's session. The question and answer box will remain open throughout the webinar, and we'll respond to questions after both panelists have presented. And a reminder that captions are available for those who wish to enable them. Before I introduce today's two panelists, I'd like to first present Cricket Media's Senior Vice President of Education Products, Laura Woodside. Laura will share a few thoughts before we pursue today's topic.
Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you could join us for today's webinar. Before we begin, we at Cricket want to acknowledge that the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion has really been at the forefront of many discussions, especially within the past couple of weeks. While today's session will stay focused on our scheduled agenda, we do encourage open and thoughtful engagement. Our conversation will explore the many benefits of linguistic diversity and multilingualism and cultural awareness in fostering diverse, inclusive, equitable, and globally connected workplaces. We invite you to participate by asking questions and sharing insights, and we'll do our best to address them throughout the session. Most importantly, we hope this webinar serves as a meaningful, safe space for learning, connection, and continued dialogue. Enjoy.
Thanks, Laura. Our first panelist today will be Kit Spielberger. Kit is a Minnesota-based content strategy and editorial leader with more than 17 years of experience in legal, government, and media organizations. They currently lead a bilingual content team dedicated to making trustworthy legal information accessible online in English and Spanish through the leading information websites such as findlaw.com, abogado.com, and superlawyers.com. Kit previously served as a leader for the Pride at Work Business Resource Group at Thomson Reuters, during which they spoke and wrote frequently about LGBTQ+ inclusion in the workplace for global audiences. And they currently sit on the board of directors of a community foundation supporting LGBTQ+ organizations and communities in the upper Midwest. Kit holds a BA in linguistics and cognitive science from Pomona College and an MBA with a concentration in strategy and leadership from the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. They have a lifelong passion for language learning. Our second panelist will be Dr. Xiomara Rivera-Pagan, Director of eLearning at Cricket Media. Dr. Rivera-Pagan has over a decade of experience with language learners in multilingual environments. She has held leadership positions, pioneered language programs, and advocated for language learning programs locally, nationally, and internationally. In addition to having worked in the school system, Dr. Rivera-Pagan serves on the board of directors with the Cultura Planera and the Third. Dr. Rivera-Pagan co-founded the nonprofit Cultura Planera, committed to creating community spaces in which families and individuals can learn, participate in, and promote the traditional Puerto Rican music styles of bamba and plena. I'd like to provide you an overview of what will be discussed today. First up, Kit will share a real-world example of how providing content in a non-English language helps ensure fairness and inclusivity nationwide. They will explore ways leaders can better support and guide teams with a range of language backgrounds, increasing both inclusivity and effectiveness. Finally, Kit will describe how multilingual communication can drive greater involvement in workplace DEI efforts, amplifying their impact. Xiomara will talk about the role of language learning in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, in both professional and educational environments. She'll highlight inspiring examples of how these efforts have succeeded in each setting. From this webinar, we hope attendees will gain insight into how linguistically inclusive content can meet vital needs of diverse communities. You'll also learn how multilingual communication plays an essential role in building more cohesive, successful teams in both workplaces and schools. We hope you also deepen your understanding of how language learning cultivates cultural understanding, enabling both professionals and students to collaborate more meaningfully and effectively. Now I'm pleased to introduce Kit, who will share different ways that workplace actions promote DEI, impacting not only the work environment, but also communities nationwide. Welcome, Kit.
Thanks, Ned. I'm very happy to be here. Before I get started, I want to caveat that I'll be drawing on experiences at both my current and former employer, but I'm not speaking on behalf of either, only from my own individual perspective. So this will be a bit of a case study in how language learning and DEI have intersected in my own career and workplace, especially over the last 5 years, during which I've built and developed and grown a bilingual team in a global organization, all while being actively involved in workplace DEI initiatives and groups. A bit of a background on my own journey to begin. I grew up a monolingual English speaker as a child, but I had the good fortune to have a great elementary school German teacher who ignited this lifelong passion for learning other languages. So by the time I arrived at college, I'd already studied Spanish and Italian as well. I continued to work on languages I've studied and explore new languages from there, and that led me to study linguistics, so the scientific study of languages in general. As I began my career, however, I ended up working in journalism and editorial roles, mostly in the English language, and language learning started to feel more like a side hobby and interest or something for travels. But this changed about 6 years ago when I was hired in a role on my current team, basically overseeing legal content teams for large legal informational websites. So the main website my team works on, findlaw.com, is basically the WebMD of the law. If you're Googling legal questions, you'll be likely to find us as a source. Our audience, it was and is anyone facing a legal issue within the United States. So a very broad and diverse audience. And overall, our team's goal has always been about making legalese, so that's almost its own language, easier to understand. Now, of course, for anyone who does not speak English as a first language or at all, there are even more barriers to accessing legal information and legal assistance. So access to justice is a huge core value of our team. As we were building out this new team 5 or 6 years ago, we inherited a Spanish language legal information website, abogado.com. At the time, our small growing team, I was the person who understood Spanish the best, and I am, again, not a native speaker, not in some realm of fluency, but I know my own limitations. But even as a second language speaker, it was clear to me that this content was not necessarily accurate. Some of it was out of date, and there were some obvious grammatical errors. If this was obvious to me as a second language learner, imagine how unauthentic and not trustworthy this would feel to a native Spanish speaker. So it certainly wasn't going to connect with an audience looking for trustworthy content about significant issues affecting their life. So as anyone who has learned a second language knows, there's a huge gap between being conversational or even very comfortable and being a native speaker. There will always be nuances you don't understand, differences in dialects, and so on. So there was no question for me that the thing to do to ensure that this information would reach our audience and with trustworthy information was to build out and hire a team of native Spanish speakers. So that's led to the bilingual team I lead today. So that's one key aspect of the intersection between language and diversity. If you're trying to reach and serve a diverse audience, which I think a lot of businesses and organizations are trying to do in one way or another, whether it's to get people information, services, or products, you need to quite literally speak the language of the audience you're trying to reach. So with this team in place, our approach to content in Avogado.com has been able to be different from our strategy for English language content tailored to the audiences we're trying to reach. Not just because the language is different, but the cultural context is different. And so I'm proud to say that today this team is able to rapidly address legal questions and needs as they occur. We've seen this, quite frankly, almost daily over the last few weeks as our team has been focused on making sure our immigration legal content is keeping up with rapidly changing laws and policies and information. So after building out a team or organization to reach people where they are with the language they speak, we get to this question of equity when you're leading such a team. If you are leading or managing a bilingual or multilingual team working in multiple languages, which in our global workforce today, more and more people are, questions of equity and fairness come up frequently. How do you make sure you're hiring, evaluating, and promoting fairly across different languages? So just using my workplace as an example, I've, over the last nearly 6 years now, been in a position of hired writers based primarily on writing samples. If I could not read a writing sample in Spanish, I would not be able to make appropriate and fair hiring decisions in the first place. Anecdotally, I've worked with, and not to throw anyone under the bus, but I have worked with recruiters who have sent me applicants for jobs who do not speak or write Spanish fluently, just say they do. And if you don't have that language background, there's no way to fairly evaluate whether someone's skills match what they're presenting. And then there comes, if you're overseeing employees working in different languages, you have to be able to effectively evaluate their work, making fair promotional decisions, for example, across the team. It's still not perfect in my workplace. This is something we're still working on. I think about this often as I want to share excellent work done by my team members. It is easier if I'm trying to share with a leader who does not speak Spanish. It's easier for me to share an example of a team member's work in English. So I'm kind of mindful about that. But it's sort of an equity issue in who is getting noticed and appreciated for good work they're doing. So I would say that if you oversee or lead a team working in multiple languages, I think it's very helpful for leaders to have at least one leader to have at least some proficiency in the languages you're working in. So that is the equity piece, ensuring that hiring, promotion, employment decisions are made using criteria that are the same across the board. Finally, I'll move on to sort of the inclusion piece, although all of these are intersected, and I'll talk a little bit about some of my work outside of my day job. As mentioned in the intro, for a lot of the past 4 years, I was involved in co-leading the Pride at Work Business Resource Group. So for people who aren't familiar with these groups, they're sometimes called employee resource groups or affinity groups, depending on the organization. The goals vary, but they're usually designed to create community, education, awareness, promote inclusion for groups of employees who have historically faced barriers to inclusion in the workplace. So the group I led was focused on LGBTQ+ inclusion in the workplace, but we worked alongside other groups. A lot of my team members, for example, were involved in the Latino Employee Network, as it was called at my employer. And I do think me being involved helped show that this type of involvement in general was valuable, encouraged team members to take the time to be involved in other groups. This is a way to signal inclusion as a leader, that you value this type of work as part of the work in your workplace, not something detracting from core responsibilities, and give team members time and energy. Rebalancing workloads is necessary so that they can participate and lead some of these activities. Being a part of these groups as part of a global organization also intersected in language learning in some interesting ways for me. My organization was headquartered in Canada at the time, but we had significant employee populations all over the globe, in Brazil, in Mexico, in India, in the Philippines, and so forth. And a lot of the discussion around, for example, inclusive language came from an English-centered approach. One classic example would be using gender-neutral language or educating about how to use gender-neutral pronouns. And that's very different if you know other languages other than English. So many Romance languages are far more gendered than English, for example. So it's harder to use gender neutral language in a Romance language than it is in English. Mandarin, for example, doesn't have any gendered pronouns to begin with. So that's almost a non-issue in that language. So being aware of these differences can make sure you're not taking too narrow an approach when working in the service of greater inclusion in theory. It's helpful to not assume everyone is approaching this from the same linguistic background. In just sort of basics of making sure people can literally understand information. Another example I have was last June, I participated in a global event around the current state of LGBTQ plus rights globally. It was a panel discussion, but it was shown to groups all over the globe, employee groups all over the globe. It was held in English, but we had candid discussions about how are we going to make sure there are accurate subtitles or other ways for people to understand this information, because it does no service to create an supposedly inclusive workplace if you're showing people something they literally cannot understand. That does not make anyone feel included there. And I do think going through the process of learning a language as an adult can help you understand firsthand how difficult it can be to engage in discussions or even watching a panel if you don't speak the language fluently. I'll end with one final example from a language I do not speak well at all, which is Portuguese. My Portuguese is pretty poor. At one point, I might have been able to hold a rudimentary conversation. I think I would struggle to do that today. But because of its similarity to Spanish, I'm able to understand it pretty well. And as I mentioned, I was working on DEI work at an organization that had a sizable employee population in Brazil. So I had the opportunity to review and see some of the content created by the Brazilian chapter of the Pride organization at this workplace. And I saw that there was a whole entire program designed for promoting trans inclusion and promoting trans employees within the workplace. We didn't have anything like this in the US. If I hadn't seen this in Portuguese and been able to understand it, I might never have known this existed. And this went a long way to helping me feel like my company truly cared about trans inclusion, and it was something I could share with other people who cared about this. It was a good reminder to take a more global perspective on what DEI looks like, and not just unthinkingly impose the narratives and the priorities and what you see from the US or English-speaking world. So wrapping up, I would say that as a leader, language learning has helped me with so many goals in leading a diverse multilingual team to serve a diverse multilingual audience. And increasingly, that's what many people who want to lead teams will be doing. And on one final personal note, it is very humbling to learn a language, especially as an adult. You will make mistakes and learn from your mistakes. And I think that humility can also be helpful in leadership as well. So with that, I will pass it back to Ned, and happy to follow up on any topics in the Q&A later.
Thank you, Kit. What you had to say was very inspirational, and obviously you have very broad background where you've been able to apply DEI in many different areas. So thank you very much for that. It provides us with valuable takeaways. Now I'm excited to introduce Xiomara, who will discuss how language training promotes DEI in both professional and educational settings. Welcome, Xiomara.
Thank you, Ned, and completely agree. That's going to be hard to follow up, but appreciate, Kit, all of those experiences. And I think that actually there's a lot of connection and a lot of similarities between our linguistic journeys, even with the fact that we've had different linguistic backgrounds. And so I'd like to start with a little bit of my individual journey, because potentially in the specific, we can find the universal. And so I was born in Puerto Rico, and I was raised in the diaspora, specifically most of the time in the United States, in the continental United States. And so even though my first language was Spanish, I primarily spoke English, especially within the classroom. And so I do remember for a very long time hearing how valued my language was, right? I remember hearing that Spanish was such an asset, such a resource, and that my bilingual capabilities were going to help me eventually. It wasn't necessarily something that I was seeing practice within the classroom. And so there was a little bit of a disconnect between what I was seeing practice within the classroom or within my social experiences and with what I was actually hearing. And so I later would find this philosophy or this description of language ideologies and orientations identified by Richard Rees in 1984. And I thought it was really helpful in understanding how individuals can view language. And so those different concepts, there's three ways that Richard Rees identifies as ways that individuals can orient towards or away from language. And the first one is language as a resource. And so that is what I was mentioning, where individuals are valuing language, they are seeing the opportunity for language. And that is something that I heard a lot of, but there was a bit of a discrepancy between where that language was able to be practiced, right? And so within the classroom, I would see that there were teachers, there were peers, there were families that would speak to the fact that language was a resource. And yet there was this distinction between, but you practice that at home. Here we practice English. And so that for me was a little bit of a moment where I got to start to think about how language is used differently. How are we talking about language? And that for me was really important as a multilingual to start thinking about how different individuals might see or think about language, especially as a multilingual. I'm thinking about language all the time, but as other individuals might not have the opportunity because they might identify as monolingual. I think that these orientations towards language give us an opportunity to have these categories to then think about, well, how am I thinking about language? And then reflect on it so that we can figure out how to practice diversity, equity, and inclusion in a language-related sense. And so from these experiences in the classroom, I finally got to middle and high school, and I was able to finally take a language. And my language learning experience within the classroom was very different from my sister's because there were certain language expectations in which language was technically viewed as a problem. And so instead of essentially seeing my background in Spanish speaking at home as an opportunity to build on, I was able to practice it. But then I remembered certain teachers or peers saying, wait, but you speak Spanish, so why don't you write in Spanish? But you speak Spanish, so why don't you know all of this? Or conversely, my sister, she had the same language experience. She was raised in a Spanish-speaking home. We were all bilingual. And so they said, no, don't take Spanish because you already know Spanish. And those language expectations, or that viewing language as a problem and then orienting an individual to then comply with your expectations for language learning, can be especially problematic in terms of their opportunity to feel included, to have equitable practices, to actually practice linguistic diversity overall, because anybody who speaks a language knows that there's multiple ways to speak any language. So I went from thinking language as a resource, maybe language as a problem, and then as I studied in my master's and my doctorate, seeing more of the opportunity to elevate language and culture in order to practice language as a right. And Kit gave us many examples of how access to language is really key and really important in terms of making sure that individuals understand what their rights are. But language as a right is this concept that because you are an individual who speaks a language, multiple languages, you should have the ability to access that language in different aspects. Now, we can't always have all of the language available at all times. And Kit gave many examples of how the work is being done in any way possible. So having those conversations in those meetings of saying, okay, well, the meeting that we're about to have might be in English, but how can we start to translate? And even starting to have those conversations and starting to think critically really starts to orient our conversations in the right direction in terms of creating more opportunities for linguistic diversity, creating more opportunities for equitable practices, including individuals in terms of their language, not only in terms of spoken language, but also in terms of sign language, excuse me. So in terms of language training and how it promotes DEI, I really love this particular quote from Jhumpa Lahiri, where she mentions a conversation involves a sort of collaboration and often an act of forgiveness. And this applies to anyone having a conversation, really, because even if you are making assumptions in terms of someone's background and you're saying, okay, we're both speaking English, we've all had a conversation where we feel like we're speaking the same language, and yet there's misunderstandings or assumptions. And this is just magnified the more linguistic diversity there is, or the more opportunities that you have to practice that kind of act of forgiveness, because you know that someone's coming as a second language learner, or maybe third or fourth language learner. They are coming with all of this linguistic ability. How are we then thinking about, okay, well, how am I viewing all of this linguistic ability as a resource to bring onto the team? It can be a little bit overwhelming to be in a situation where you might feel like you are learning with the person. We don't all have the answers. And that's one of the opportunities that language training essentially provides us. It allows us the opportunity to foster cross-cultural understanding and promote inclusive communication. It promotes cultural competence and leadership, like Kit mentioned. It helps dispel stereotypes. It encourages employees to explore nuances of different languages and cultures. Because again, even those individuals who have different languages and different cultures, the more that we talk about those different languages and those different cultures and the similarities and the differences, we see new opportunities to go even further in terms of understanding and dispelling some of those stereotypes. So just because I meet somebody who is speaking even Brazilian Portuguese has many diverse ways of speaking within the country, and then the diaspora, there's many ways to speak a language. And so the more that I engage in those conversations in a thoughtful and critical way, the more that I think to myself, okay, how can I practice the idea or the concept of language as a resource or language as a right? And maybe I come to a conversation and I am trying to solve the question of how to communicate as effectively as possible. Maybe my first instinct is, oh no, this communication, this language might be a problem. That gives me an opportunity. It does not make me a bad guy. We all have a moment where we have the opportunity to reflect and think to ourselves, okay, well, I'm trying to solve this problem. How do I do it in the best interest of maintaining equitable practices? How do I do it in the best interest of still maintaining inclusive practices? Because linguistic diversity is beautiful. And by including those different voices, those different ideas, you get the opportunity, like Kit mentioned, to actually participate and not reinventing the wheel. You see what other cultures and organizations globally are doing, and you can become inspired by that and then bring that back to your team to grow. So it enables professionals to engage more meaningfully, respectfully with colleagues, partners, and customers. And so I'd love to give an example of one of the organizations that we work with here at Cricket eLearning, and that's Fairfax County Head Start. And for those of you who are less familiar, Head Start is a program that promotes school readiness for young children from low-income families by enhancing their cognitive, social, and emotional development. And although they're positioned under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as they feed into the school system, it's important to kind of get a picture of the linguistic diversity and the size of Fairfax County. And so it's the 9th largest school system in the U.S. and in terms of language abilities. 21% of the student population is identified as multilingual learners. And so what that means is that 21% of the population, the student population, is essentially, in addition to their home language or languages, acquiring English. So these are brilliant beings who are learning all of these languages all at the same time. And so teachers and leaders from the school system wanted to make sure that those students, those families, their community members were supported. And so they started working with us in 2023 with 5 teachers who are essentially building their linguistic capacity in terms of Spanish, Arabic, and English. And so when I say building capacity, I think it's really important that we keep in mind that language is a lifelong journey. And we all have our different language learning goals when we embark on that journey. And so I think it's really important that we remember that, so that we don't say to ourselves, well, I'll never be fluent, so why even try? Or I'll never learn as much as I can, or as much as I would like to, so this feels like an overwhelming task to even embark on. The question that we should all be asking ourselves is, what are our language goals? And in this particular program, the teachers and the leaders were really seeking out to communicate with the students and the families in the most respectful, thoughtful, social way as possible. And that's a beautiful entry point in terms of creating that equitable access, including that community. And in fact, one of the teachers, in addition to acquiring an additional language, was actually working to build their capacity in terms of English. And so it reminds us that even if we practice a language on an everyday basis, and even within our work, that practicing different aspects of language, for example, spoken versus written, like I mentioned before, I was a heritage speaker, but I didn't have the opportunities to practice language in terms of the written form. So thinking about all of that and thinking about what is your really focused goal so that you can support your community through your organization or your school is really important in terms of feeling like you are making the advances and opening up space in a meaningful way. And so I'd love to share a quote from one of the educators that actually worked with the program and was able to increase their proficiency in terms of Spanish language learning. They mentioned, taking Spanish classes has been a game changer in my ability to connect with the families I serve at my job. Recently, I was able to conduct a full parent orientation in Spanish, which allowed me to communicate directly and build stronger relationships with families who primarily speak the language. Additionally, I can now observe a classroom where only Spanish is spoken and still understand the lessons and interactions taking place. These language skills have already made a meaningful impact on my work, and I look forward to growing even more in my ability to serve Spanish-speaking families effectively. And so that quote speaks beautifully to their language goals of wanting to communicate with the families more directly. And it doesn't speak anything to speaking perfectly, because any of us who speak any language, we know that we make mistakes all the time. That makes us human, that connects us, and that is okay. But what is really important is that individuals, especially the individuals who you are working with on an everyday basis, especially multilingual individuals who are taking those language risks, who are making sure that they are extending themselves to in a space that they might not feel as comfortable, to see that exchange, that cultural exchange, that linguistic exchange, that space for practicing risk-taking and respect, for accepting that mistakes are a part of communication. I think that that speaks directly to the values that we all want to essentially create in order to make spaces more inclusive so that we can expand our community, whether it be for businesses or for school organizations. And so some personal insights, and the Head Start example is an interesting example because it's kind of a combination between an organization as well as an educational setting. But if we wanted to think more specifically about educational settings, In my experience, and research shows that language is associated with social preference from as early as even before 5 to 6, but there are studies done by many institutions globally in order to reinforce that already by the age of 5 to 6, individuals are starting to notice that there are similarities and differences between their language. So they might notice that English is spoken similarly, but not the same as in their household. And so starting to think about that at the earliest level possible, it helps to promote early development of cross-cultural collaboration skills. It creates a foundation for meaningful relationships and success in personal and professional life. Similarly, as young as age 5 to 6, those students, those children, the children are starting to recognize that not only are there differences, but they're starting to have certain preferences in terms of this is more similar, so I prefer something that is more similar, which is absolutely normal because we as humans are always looking for familiarity in order to feel safe. And so as we think about how we expand our opportunities to engage in linguistic diversity, we essentially create opportunities for our students, our teachers, our community to normalize the fact that linguistic diversity is normal. So in the example, similar to my example in terms of world language teaching when I was at an IB school, we had students that were coming in and their home language was Spanish. And so the question then started to become, how are we creating equitable programming for these students, not just placing them in a Spanish 1A class because that is all we had at the time, but instead thinking about, well, what do these heritage language speakers really need in order to maximize the learning within the classroom? How do we focus on their backgrounds? And a lot of this has everything to do with starting to just engage in dialogue, to start to talk to your students, to start to talk to your employees, to start to talk to your community members, and engage them in a conversation of what is your experience with language? How have you practiced language? How have you practiced spoken language versus written language? Have you practiced the language, your home language, in terms of instruction? Because there are some students like myself who have always spoken their home language, but have never gotten instruction in terms of their home language. So starting to think about that curiosity and engaging in that conversation. And I know that as a teacher, we have many things to consider. And so I mention it as a point that I'm hoping that it opens up the door so that those conversations and those dialogues happen, and then those connections in terms of language practice or cultural practice are even more meaningful, and you feel even more supported in all of the wonderful work that teachers are doing around the world, because teachers are the backbone of everything. So those were a couple of examples, but I'd like to close out with, if I were attending this session, I know that my first question is, yes, I agree, all of what was said, this is great. But what can I do today? As a teacher, I know I'm always trying to figure out, but what is the next step? What can I actually apply today? And so what I would encourage us to do, we've had a lot of conversations, and there's going to be a place for questions to start. You can start dropping them in the Q&A. But I would definitely encourage us to start from a place of, number one, understanding the language abilities and needs within your organization or school. So there are hundreds of languages that we would love to attend to, and that's spoken and signed has another range of languages. And so if we could, we would love to, but the reality is that there are limited resources, and understanding that, we need to make sure that your time, resources, funds are being used to in the most efficient way possible. And so it's really key that you're engaging in conversation and understanding what your particular community needs in terms of language, what their abilities already are, what their language goals are, because that will help direct what kind of language programming you might want to put into place. And from there, you can tier from need into want. Number two, to create a language plan. Language, like anything else, needs to be planned in order for it to be meaningful and effective. And like we've mentioned many times, everyone's doing so much. In schools, in businesses, organizations, everyone is doing a lot, especially today. And so in order to not only be efficient, but also be effective and also celebrate when you achieve those goals, it's really important that you create a plan. Then you implement that plan, and there are many different plans that can be shared, but implement that plan that is most reasonable for your organization or school, and then revisit and revise, because just like anything else, a language plan should be revisited and revised because demographics change, community changes, language needs change, language abilities change. And so at the most basic level, we are hopeful that these 4 points kind of give you some direction, that the language orientations give you an ability to start to think about different ways in order to reflect on language and also dialogue about language, either with your leadership, with your teachers, with other individuals who you might not have had an opportunity to think about how language diversity is actually creating more meaningful, has the potential to create more meaningful opportunity. But hopefully those orientations, the experiences that Kit and I shared, and this plan starts to engage us in some meaningful dialogue.
Thanks, Xiomara. We appreciate you sharing your multifaceted perspective, including insights from educational and workplace settings, and also your own personal experience. So thanks for sharing those. Very valuable to us. We've had 2 great panelists today. We've heard today how linguistically inclusive strategies can address the critical needs of diverse communities, creating opportunities for greater equity. We've explored how multilingual communication can foster collaboration and inclusivity, whether in the workplace or in schools. Finally, we've seen how language learning empowers individuals, including professionals and students, to build cultural awareness and engage with others in ways that are both measurable and impactful. We hope the examples and insights shared today, though they're just a small glimpse of work being done to enhance DEI, spark new ideas and enthusiasm for your future efforts. Now, I'd like to entertain any questions attendees might have for our panelists. I've noticed that we do have a couple already in the Q&A box. Okay, so I won't mention the names of who's asking the questions for privacy reasons. The first one that came in, good morning. Based on your experience working with multilingual teams, do you think that a native speaker from any other language like Spanish, even if fluent in English, but native in another language, still faces barriers in understanding English concepts or context when related to projects or readings? Do you think it's fair to provide extra time to allow comprehension, such as tests that provide extra time? Even me, being fluent in both languages, I sometimes find words I need to research more to apply to the content and meaning, which makes me feel at a disadvantage.
May I?
Yeah. Laura.
Well, get us started.
Okay, I will get us started. And I think the first thing that comes to mind, whether in an educational or workplace setting, is if you are designing any kind of test or project, don't accidentally be testing and evaluating language comprehension or language ability if that's not actually what you're doing. this example calls that to mind. So it might be if it is not about I work in a writing and editing field where the language is is the point, but if I were evaluating people where the job is we're creating code and it doesn't matter your what language you speak or are working in, if my instructions are in English and are very hard to understand, that puts certain people at a disadvantage. So I think of a lot of concepts that we've gotten from the accessibility lens is what's making things accessible to as wide a group as possible. And often when it comes to language, that looks like really making the language as simple and clear as possible so that nobody, regardless of their linguistic background, is at a disadvantage. But it also means acknowledging if people are reading something in their second language or at a difficult level, yes, I do think more time would be reasonable in those cases. Depends on the case, but I think looking at it through the lens of inclusivity and accessibility and not evaluating someone on language skills if that's not the purpose of what you are evaluating. If you're at an educational level, if it's a word problem in math and the words are complicated, you're not actually testing anyone's math ability, to use a simple example. Those are my initial thoughts.
That was beautifully put. I think I am going to go in that same direction. I agree with the objective. What is the objective of whatever it is that you are trying to achieve? And as long as you are achieving the objective and it does not interfere with the overarching goal, then increasing the time is okay. It really has everything to do with the task that you need to complete, and as long as you can complete it in a way that it achieves the goal, I think more or less time could be given, and it's absolutely no problem. The second thing that comes to mind is this. It's really important to understand the industry-specific language is a whole world in and of itself. And so there are many monolingual or English-only speakers that would still need to do exactly what this person is doing in terms of needing extra time for comprehension, needing extra time in order to look up words, make sure that they're communicating what they're saying effectively. Even someone who is English dominant might not necessarily feel as confident expressing themselves written versus speaking. So that extra time actually, it can come up for many reasons that have nothing to do with your multilingual ability. So the first thing that I think of is that your multilingual ability brings up more opportunity for your organization than anything else. Number two, the extra time that you're discussing or the kind of diving in order to comprehend is actually something that still might happen with somebody who is English dominant or English only. So it's really important that we don't judge ourselves too harshly for needing a little bit more time or support in terms of understanding the language, because all of that industry specific, academic language, all of that is something that you need to unpack. And then each time you go into a new organization, there's a new culture of how we speak to each other that you need to process as well. So there's many factors that go into communication, projects, reading. So I would say it's absolutely reasonable. And sometimes it's just a matter of pitching to leadership or your team members in order to remind them of how your multilingual ability is language as a resource and it's not a problem. And this could actually happen in other aspects as well. So hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, thanks, Ziamara. Thanks, Kit. The person who just asked the question appreciated your responses. She just sent a note. And our next question, Ziamara, I think this one's going to be in your wheelhouse. What could a language plan look like in a virtual setting?
Absolutely. So at the simplest terms, it's similar to any plan that you would create. Think about going to the gym. You can't go to the gym and expect to feel like you're making progress if you don't have a plan in terms of what are you trying to do, what is your goal, and how long, how much time are you going to give yourself in order to achieve that? How are you going to check back in? So similarly, a language plan could look like that in person or virtually, where you essentially say, you evaluate the needs and abilities of your organization. You say to yourself, okay, our school, for example, has a high population of students who speak Spanish and Arabic. And so we're going to focus on those two languages. And maybe we have staff members who decide, okay, I'm going to volunteer to start to work on Spanish because I have a good amount of students who speak Spanish. These other teachers are going to take on Arabic. Maybe they come together in order to teach each other to create that community element. When are we going to check in with our teachers in order to assess our proficiency, in order to, most importantly, feel like you're making progress? Because as learners, we need to feel like we are increasing our proficiency to maintain that motivation. That's the same for anybody. And then at the end, see if we were able to achieve that goal. If we were, then we create a new goal. If we were not, then we look at how we implemented that plan. Did we focus too much on speaking? Did we not focus enough on writing? Are there certain tasks that we should have come to our teacher in order to say, okay, these specific tasks would be really helpful to make sure that we feel very proficient, and maybe it's writing to parents and asking for permission for X. Or in an organization, maybe you have a team that is located in Berlin, and you want to make sure that you speak with them in a way that is thoughtful, and maybe you're just focusing on social language. So there could be many language goals, but the plan really is focused on who are you working with, who are your learners, what are you trying to achieve in terms of language learning, when are you trying to achieve it by, and what are your checkpoints in order to make sure that with your teacher, you're moving in the right direction, so you're not 6 months into your language learning and you realize maybe this is not as useful. And so that is part of the language plan. The other part of the language plan is actually coming up with the talking points and the budget that you would need in order to propose it to your leadership, which is another big piece. And that is something that I would say is really helpful to do in collaboration with individuals who have already done it. And so we have an organization that we've been working with for a very long time, and their funding is shifting. And so they are now needing to revise the way that they were learning and revise the budget requests. And so essentially, our customer engagement specialist, who's a very brilliant and creative person, and works on this, can essentially say, okay, I know you guys, I know your language goals, I know what you're working towards. So what about you can propose plan A, B, or C? And so if you are not someone who has a lot of experience in language planning, recognize and know that there are other individuals who have been doing this. Kit gave a bunch of examples of how language is practiced in different ways. So look to those individuals who are already doing it and start to engage them in, how did you do this? We do not have to do this alone. Language planning can look like a few different things in terms of actual implementation, but also leadership, decision-making is a big part of it. And I would say, do it in community and do it with those who have been doing it for a while.
Great, thanks. Very comprehensive answers, Ziamara. Kit, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I have very little to add. Maybe even just that the practice of language learning and practice looks different in a virtual versus an in-person setting. There are obviously new tools at your disposal that you might have when engaging in different languages in a virtual setting, or whether on-demand translation or the ability to easily look things up, but you also lose some of the ability to have sort of the in-person, either gestural or other contexts to find shared meaning when the words fail. So there's some advantages, some disadvantages, but I think calling out that a virtual setting is a very different setting to be practicing and learning languages might be valuable here.
Great. Any other questions from our attendees? Please feel free to add some. Doesn't look like any more are coming in. Okay, if we don't have any further questions, I guess we'll move on. Before we conclude, I'd like to provide some information on how you can follow up with us to learn more. Please write to us at the following email address, institutional@cricketmedia.com. Again, that's institutional@cricketmedia.com. And I'll go ahead and insert this address in the chat. There you go. Please feel free to make use of that. Well, this concludes today's webinar, and I feel very privileged to have taken part in it. Very important topics, obviously, and I think our panelists did a great job. Thank you so much for joining our discussion, Empowering Equity, the Impact of Multilingualism on DEI in Workplaces and Schools. We hope you found the session valuable and invite you to participate in our future discussions. And for those of you who aren't aware of this, we do have webinars every 3 months or so, so please feel free to come back and join us. Your engagement is very important to us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, feel free to follow up by writing us with any thoughts or questions. Take care.